Americans celebrate the 4th of July and Veterans Day with holiday weekends. And of course, Memorial Day is a national holiday as well. But as 6 News' Brent Weber tells us, Memorial Day has a different meaning than those others, one that veterans and their family members don't want to forget.
Memorial Day is about recollection and honor, remembrance and family. Then there is what it's not about.
A lot of people like to think today is about all veterans, but today is specifically to remember and memorialize those veterans that paid the ultimate sacrifice, gave their life defending the freedoms of the United States.
Memorial Day was never meant to be a celebration, and by calling it a celebration, it loses the meaning of the holiday.
In a quarter century serving with the Air Force, Wilbur was deployed 6 times in the Middle East, twice in Africa, with the wounds to prove it. But on this day, he remembers grandfathers who fought bloody battles at Iwo Jima and Saipan, and most of all, his fellows.
When we were in Kuwait, Tim Weaver said, "Remember those guys that we just geared up to go into Afghanistan?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Some of them didn't make it." And I remember their faces. I don't remember the names, but I remember their faces burnt into my skull, as if I was just shaking their hands yesterday before they got on that C-130 and went into Afghanistan.
This Memorial Day, a reflective one, perhaps summed up by a plaque at Omaha National Cemetery, quoting Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
Their stories are family stories. We're very proud of them. And one of them is that my aunt was married just a week or 2 before her husband went to war in the Guadalcanal, and a grenade was thrown into a trench by a Japanese soldier, and he died. Love my family, and I'm proud that they fought for our freedoms and served our country faithfully.
On your side, Brent Weber, 6 News.
VFW Post 2280 in Bellevue has seen its Memorial Day ceremony increase from just a half dozen people a couple of years ago to more than 100 today.